Spanish flu, a detailed review of the 1918 Spanish influenza pandemic. In 1918, a new strain of influenza resulted in a pandemic that is estimated to have infected 1/3 of the world's population. It killed as many as 40 million of these people. What was this new virus, and how did this happen? The first wave of influenza in 1918 began in March. It was characterized by high morbidity, but mortality was not above average. The second wave in September was much more virulent. People began to note similarities between the two waves, which led them to believe that they were the same disease. Clinically, the waves were the same. People developed the typical flu symptoms of fever, chills, and fatigue. There were very few cases in the first wave where the virus replicated in the lung, leading to fatal pneumonia, presenting as hemorrhages in the lungs upon autopsy. However, in the fall strain, there was an explosion of such cases, which was the reason for the much higher mortality rate. One characteristic unique to this illness was the high death rate among 15 to 45-year-olds. In the past, illnesses had caused deaths mostly among the very young and very old. Scientists and doctors did not know what caused the disease, but since the outbreak occurred during World War I, people believed it was spread from camp to camp by infected soldiers and then carried overseas. The Spanish flu did not originate in Spain, but since Spain was not subject to the media blackouts that most countries were mandated to during the war, they became the first country to report on Spanish flu. This led to the belief that they were the first to experience it. Modern theories point to France, China, Britain, or the United States as the place of origination. Virology was not yet established in 1918, and germ theory prevailed. Today, we know that the Spanish flu was caused by an influenza A virus of the H1N1 type with avian origin. The entire genome of the 1918 influenza was sequenced, but it is still unknown how the virus adapted to humans. While all 8 gene segments are distinctly avian-like, they are genetically different from any avian or mammalian influenza viruses studied from 1917 to 2009. Variations in the receptor binding genes enabled the HA protein of the virus to bind only to sialic acid receptors of mammalian cells. The HA protein is expressed on the surface of the influenza virus. When cleaved, it becomes active, at which point it binds to receptors on host cells, causing infection. The 1918 viral HA lacked the cleavage site mutation found in current influenza subtypes, H5 and H7, of extra basic amino acids, which make them extremely virulent. This is one evolutionary difference. The Spanish flu was the same kind of flu that we know and experience in modern times, and also the same as the influenza that preceded it. Influenza mutates, creating many different strains, which change and adapt over time. Some are more virulent than others. Symptoms have remained the same over time and typically include 4 to 5 days of fever, chills, headache, muscle pain, weakness, and sometimes cough and upper respiratory symptoms. It is the upper respiratory symptoms that usually cause the most severe problems. Some type of bacterial pneumonia is typically the cause of flu-related deaths today, as was the case with the Spanish flu. Doctors in 1918 attempted to fight the pandemic by imposing quarantines, mandating the wearing of masks, shutting down public places where large groups of people would gather, including schools, suggesting people limit contact with one another, and discouraging handshaking, and even banning spitting. There were also recommendations to avoid anyone recently recovered, to remove all necessary furnishings from sick rooms, to halt funeral services, boiling clothes of the ill, and scouring living areas. This is all strikingly similar to what we see today, as evidenced by COVID-19 prevention measures. Treatment included sweating, bleeding, eating soft, bland foods, and staying hydrated, drinking old wine and brandy if pneumonia was contracted, and applying compresses of vinegar and stale water from the room. Medications included digitalis, aspirin, quinine, alcohol compresses, garlic, and anything else believed to have medicinal effects. Nothing worked. Today, we treat influenza with antivirals, and there is also a vaccine to prevent the flu. We do, however, follow the same distancing and sanitizing protocols. People were terrified of contracting Spanish flu. No one knew what caused it, and with half the population infected and so many deaths, everyone was paranoid and suspicious of their neighbor. Entire families were killed. Many widows and orphans were left behind. The economy suffered drastically as businesses closed down, including mail and garbage services and public health departments. Hospitals were overrun, and the dead piled up as the death rate outpaced the capacity for burial. It was a time of great fear and panic. There was public demand and much effort invested in finding a vaccine or serum to no avail. Following the end of the pandemic in the summer of 1919, many suffered from what we now know as depression. Since we have a vaccine and there are treatment options, society does not react in the same way to influenza as they did in 1918. We are still wary, and certain populations are very fearful of contracting influenza, but we do not see the same mortality rates as those who lived through the Spanish flu witnessed.